Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. War and plans of war, sickness, disease, and gruesome attacks are just some of the stories that we'll be covering with you in today's news broadcast. But first, let's look at a bit of positive news. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko vowed to seek a peaceful solution to the conflict in the eastern part of the country after recent fighting between government forces and the anti-government troops killed 17 people in just one day. He said at a recent press conference that he would be meeting Russian President Vladimir Putin, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and French President Francois Hollande on January 15th in Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan. Now, the leaders plan to discuss ways to end the war that has already claimed over 4,700 lives since April of 2014.
That's a positive change, that the leaders are looking to actually do something to put an end to what we see taking place.
Absolutely.
Well, Mickey Mouse might not be the only thing you come into contact with at Disney theme parks. The California Department of Public Health has reported 9 people came down with the measles. Now, that's something you don't hear on an everyday report after visiting either Disneyland or Disney Adventure Park between December 15th and December 20th. Health officials can't say for sure where these people were infected, but it's likely that the rare disease was spread from one person around those parks during that time period right before the holidays.
Dr. John Day-Bexiden explains the only way you can catch the measles is from somebody who has the measles. And if you're within sneezing distance or coughing distance, or if you even touch something and then rub your face or eyes right afterwards, you can get the disease. Now, measles symptoms include high fever, cough, runny nose, and red eyes, followed by a rash that will break out days after these symptoms appear.
Well, sounds like with it being so easy to contract that it would be actually a rare disease, but you know, that's interesting. And Disney World is Disneyland's a pretty populous area,
That's right.
So thankfully not many more got it. Now, a more common illness is taking turn for the worse this season. The flu has been linked to the deaths of several young children recently, sadly enough. Among them, a 3-year-old girl from Iowa went from being the picture of perfect health to being rushed to a Des Moines hospital severely dehydrated and in pain. In just a few days after showing initial flu symptoms, Jeff, she died. Wow. Well, a 7-year-old girl also, Ruby Hansen from Minnesota, also died. Her mother believes she would still be alive today had she not had a pre-existing condition, which was a Dravet syndrome, which is a seizure disorder, which gravely worsened when she developed the flu.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has added these children to their grim statistics, which show the flu has reached an epidemic level in the United States. Now, one strain in particular, the H3N2, has mutated this season. Now, this mutation has caused the vaccinations to be much less effective. The flu has been felt far and wide, and the current influenza levels are these levels in at least 36 states are approaching the peak levels that we saw 2 years ago. So they're really rising now.
Right. And not too long ago, we just talked about the fact that the recent batch of flu vaccines, the CDC came out and were saying that they're not even working.
But go ahead and take them
They were still
anyways.
saying, encouraging you to do it, but they're not. They're basically useless. Well, this means doctors are seeing more patients, and Dr. Raul Carr of Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago reported that in one day he saw about 35 patients, 10 of which had positive flu swabs, and others that didn't even get swabbed but were just treated because the flu was so prevalent. In other words, the symptoms were already showing, so he just went on in there and treated them as a result. Officials are still recommending getting a flu shot, even though it may not completely prevent against it. So it seems like a catch-20 there, right?
Now, the Connecticut Supreme Court has ruled that the state can force a 17-year-old to undergo chemotherapy. Cassandra C., as she is known, was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma this past September. Now, doctors claim that with treatment, her chance of survival is about 85%, but without the chemotherapy, they say that most people will die within 2 years. The family's lawyers argue that the 17-year-old was mature enough to choose her plan for treatment of the cancer and should have that right.
Mm-hmm. Well, the teen's mother, Jackie Fortin, supports Cassandra in her desire to find a medical alternative, calling chemotherapy toxic and poison. When asked how she could agree with her daughter not getting chemo, which could kill the cancer and save her life, she responded, "But they're also killing her body. They're killing her organs. They're killing her insides. And it's not even a matter of dying. She's not going to die," her mother said. She doesn't want to die.
In November, a lower court had ordered Cassandra to take chemotherapy, but after 2 treatments, she ran away. Now, the state then took temporary custody, and she is currently confined to a hospital room where she is receiving the chemotherapy treatment. Cassandra turns 18 in 9 months and could legally reject the medical treatment, but ironically, her full course of treatment will be finished 3 months prior to that.
Oh, amazing. Well, take a look at this sequence of MRI scans that we're going to show you here next. They show the movement of a tapeworm. That's right, a tapeworm inside a person's brain over a 4-year period. Cambridge scientists say the parasite, which measured 2 centimeters, had never been reported in the UK before. After suffering from headaches and seizures, the 50-year-old Chinese man was admitted to a hospital. Initial tests had left the doctors baffled.
Definitely not something you'd want to see on an MRI.
No way.
Well, new video evidence was released in the Cleveland police shooting death of Tamir Rice. If you remember, the police were responding to a 911 call about an armed man, but the weapon turned out to be a toy pellet gun and the man a 12-year-old boy instead. Now, the city had already released a video of the moment Tamir was shot, but nothing past that.
Right. And from the newly released video, we can see the boy shot by a Cleveland police officer less than 2 seconds after the police car pulled up just a few feet from him. As he lies bleeding behind the police car, just out of camera view there, from a stomach wound, the officers can be seen standing around and talking to each other.
Next, when Tamir's 14-year-old sister runs towards her brother to see what happened, she is thrown to the ground by the police officers, not once, but 3 times, then is handcuffed and put into the back of their police car, where she remains for the rest of the 30-minute tape. The boy's mother, Samaria Rice, cannot be seen in the video, but was nearby. Now, she said she was told if she didn't calm down, they would put her in the back of the patrol car as well.
Wow. The tape timeline shows paramedics arriving 8 minutes after the shooting. Then they attended to Tamir on the ground for another 6 minutes before carrying him away on the stretcher. He died in the hospital the next day. The family's attorney, Walter Madison, questioned the minutes that passed before anything was done to help Tamir, saying, "We know those first moments after trauma are so crucial." And of course, he laid there for about approximately 8 minutes before actual paramedics arrived. So who knows what could have been done at that point.
Well, Katan, we've mentioned before about the high murder rate in Chicago, Illinois, but listen to this. At least 419 people were killed this year across a dozen Chicago neighborhoods, and that is more than all the U.S. troops killed in Afghanistan this year.
Wow.
Now, Chicago's police say they've seized more guns this past year than New York and Los Angeles combined. However, the violence is still so bad that heavily armed police now have to attend the gang funerals to prevent revenge killings.
Wow. The Chicago gangs are fighting a war over turf. drugs, and money. In a CBS interview, Police Commander Leo Schmitz of the 7th District, a gang-infested section of the city's south side, said, "What used to be a fist fight now turns to let's go to the guns." Schmidt and his team patrol the streets as children are getting out of school. And he said when you have these coming out of school and there's any kind of gang conflicts, you've got the mix of what he compared to fire and gasoline.
Well, the shooting deaths were up 20% in the city this past year. And so far this year, it doesn't look any better. Among the victims this past weekend was an off-duty police officer.
Well, continuing with our broadcasts, Russia has had an interesting time in the international community lately. In 2014, Russia and its leader, Vladimir Putin, went from being on top of the world to becoming an international outcast. From the conflict in Crimea to increasing pressures through sanctions to the drop in oil prices, which caused the ruble to plummet, Russia was an example of how things can go from prosperous to disastrous in a very short period of time.
So what does 2015 have to hold for our global society? Well, from a security standpoint, Russia is at the top of the list to be aware of. Analysts say because it relies on the petrodollar and the fact that it's wounded and angry, combined with the fact that Putin strives on providing a better standard of living for the country. So when that starts to collapse, he could be in big trouble and could lash out.
I think they say waking the bear, awaking the bear. Well, Greece is still in the crosshairs economically as the euro is at a nine-year low compared to the dollar, and a progressive political party is looking to win the elections in Greece, which may cause an abandonment of the austerity measures for Greece, which could, of course, cause a ripple effect throughout the eurozone and create a fissure between the richer countries such as Germany and France within the EU, which would in turn create a greater deal of anxiety in that region.
Well, even China, which has the second largest economy in the world, has an unstable economy and could, with social unrest, lead to political unrest, which could affect the rest of the international community.
And they just recently got through a large slew of protests taking place there as well. So we see how that can spread very fast. And lastly, the Iraqi-Syrian crisis with ISIS causing unrest in the region, which could threaten the security of its neighbors and become an ultimate disaster for the people living in that part of the world.
Well, now for further details concerning the turmoil among the nations, YPN's Larry McGee has our story on the current battle between the West and Islam and the increasing tension in France. Larry, what are the analysts reporting?
Well, echoing the sentiment of the international statesman Henry Kissinger in his book, New World Order in Crisis, commentators are crying that the U.S. is losing, and the anticipation is that it is only a matter of time before America is struck with another incident such as 9/11. From the bombing of U.S. embassies to the kidnapping and execution of American citizens, analysts say the hatred for America is both obvious and apparent. The question posed by such opinions is how much proof do the American people need? While asserting that so-called terrorist cells are growing, the appeal for America and the global body is to consider different and more intense defensive action. In what is guaranteed to be presented as evidence of that thought, cold-blooded murder was captured and broadcast throughout the world this week, executed by what the media are calling calculating, well-armed and well-trained killers. European Strategic Intelligence and Security Center representative Claude Monaquet says, speaking regarding the incident that has been billed the attack in Paris, the perpetrators were probably trained in real war conditions, and that points to Syria and what is being called the Syrian Jihad. The French police are currently involved in a massive search for two brothers and an 18-year-old accomplice whom they believe to be responsible for the gruesome slayings. Among them, Stéphane Charbonnet, editor and cartoonist at the provocative French magazine Charlie Hebdo, notorious for ridiculing and disrespecting politicians and religion, including Islam and the historic figure Muslims consider to be a prophet. The magazine's office was torched in 2011, and Charbonnet hired bodyguards, but went on record as saying that he would rather die than live like a rat. He was one of the first people executed in the attack this week. Analysts report that since France has been very confrontational and has taken a hardline stance against Islam and certain of its practices, such as the wearing of the veil, they are at the top of the hit list where terrorists are concerned, and this week's attacks thus come as no surprise. Supporting this fact, speaking at an emergency security meeting, French President Hollande publicly acknowledged that the French government was aware that attacks were being calculated. The attacks have brought to the forefront French politicians such as Marine Le Pen, who are declaring that the time is up for denial and hypocrisy. The absolute rejection of the Islamic fundamentalism must be proclaimed loudly and clearly. This week's events have placed a glowing spotlight on the increasing hostility between the country's Muslim and immigrant communities and a large portion of the French society. In Marseille, the second largest city in France, there is now reportedly tens of thousands of immigrants from across Europe and North Africa, and by some estimates, the city is now 30 to 40% Muslim, one of the largest populations of Muslims anywhere in the Catholic country, historically remembered for the papal decadence of the Avignon exile. Even before the recent attacks, tension between Muslims and non-Muslims had been escalating in Marseille. Native residents say things are changing. Even though there had been previous immigration from the Spanish and Italians, things nonetheless work fine, probably because everyone was of the same religion. But what has come after is a lot more complicated and less integrated, and this is what some residents say is responsible for the uneasiness. The Muslim perspective, however, sees the current conflict as an issue of intolerance, where Muslims are excluded on the basis of their religion and attacked for exercising modesty, like adorning the headscarf. The statistics seem to support their position, where in a recent survey, 72% of the residents of the Catholic nation of France were reported to have an unfavorable view of Muslims. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan, Jeff, back to you.
Seems almost like another one of those hopeless situations. Well, continuing in the topic of terrorism, Senator Lindsey Graham tweeted, "I fear we're entering a new phase against terrorism, and we'll find ourselves dealing with more terror groups, safe havens, and capability than before 9/11. In an interview with Fox News, he said that, again, we have more terrorists than before 9/11, and there's a kind of terrorist Olympics, he said, a terrorist Olympics going on now, and the one who can hit us here in the United States is the one who'll get the gold medal."
Wow. Well, the U.S. State Department recently released a list of unsafe places in the world and listed every continent except the United States. Now, Graham said that's not true. They would rather hit us here than any other place in the world, and more organizations are trying to come to the U.S.
Britain's MI5 has warned that al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria are planning mass casualty attacks against Western countries. MI5 Chief Andrew Parker says that it is highly likely that Britain would be targeted. Targets include transport systems in iconic areas to ensure large amounts of loss of life. So these things are planning to take out a huge amount of people in one time. With 3 terror plots foiled in the last several months, he describes Britain's terror threat as very serious. He also said some of these threats could be coming from British nationals who've recently went abroad to join ISIS fighters.
Well, NATO's previous Secretary General, Anders Rasmussen from Denmark, addressed people at the Carnegie Europe meeting and said that keeping NATO strong could not be more important. He continued, "There is an arc of crisis and instability that stretches from the east to the south, and it poses a threat to our populations and our territories. We see challenges on a scale that we have not seen for over 2 decades, and they will endure for years to come, and we need to face this fact."
To the east, he said, there is Russia, and we have worked hard and long to build a partnership with Russia that respects Russia's security concerns and based on international rules and norms. But, he said, Russia has rejected their offers and considers NATO and the West as an adversary. Now, Rasmussen continued by saying Russia has used economic pressure and military force to induce instability in those regions, to manufacture conflicts, and to lessen the independence of its neighbors.
In regards to the Ukraine crisis, the president is sending more Air Force units to the Baltics, and the U.S. will commit more troops to a NATO rapid response force in Eastern Europe. NATO has staged troops running drills in countries on the front line neighboring Russia, such as Poland, Lithuania, and Estonia. And NATO is planning to make this deployment more permanent with its new rapid response force, 4,000 strong.
This military spearhead is pointed right at Vladimir Putin and his Eastern European ambitions, as they say, which upset many in the international community and caught the West off guard. Alex Nickel of the International Institute of Strategic Studies said, if a threat comes up, say in the Baltic, NATO would be able to respond very rapidly, like within 48 hours, and take actions that might deter aggressive actions from another country.
Well, the journalist recounts the growing conflict in Crimea and how she saw things from the beginning. From protest in Crimea to Donetsk, with heightened military presence at the borders, the likes of which she said she's never seen before. Now that topped with an increasing amount of anger and hostility.
And we see everything build up from that point up to what it was when this conflict started about 7 months ago. Iran's revolutionary leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, said that the enemies are working hard to sow the seeds of disunity among Shias and Sunnis. He also stated that the Shia version of spy agencies connected with Britain's version of the MI6 and the Sunni version of, which is the mercenaries of the CIA, are fake and in cahoots against Islam. He also said that Iran has always tried to put friendship on top of its list with its neighbors, and that Muslims need to stand united against the global arrogance of the United States and the cancerous Israeli regime.
Well, in a story from NBC's Meet the Press with Chuck Todd, he reminded us that this year, 2015, President Obama promised us that this would be the year that we wouldn't have to worry about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, although troops were pulled out in 2014, there will still be 11,000 troops in Afghanistan due to a resurgent Taliban and nearly 3,000 in Iraq with the ISIS uprising. Now, many are saying that this is what appears to be wars without an end.
Yeah, well, and we talked about not too long ago, just in the last broadcast, how much military power and force is actually going into these wars, not to mention the amount of money that's being spent to support these. Yeah, that's right. Well, ISIS has stepped up its brutality by asking online for tips as to how to murder a Jordanian pilot it captured last month. Now, the pilot was the first coalition pilot to be taken captive in fighting, and sadly, suggestions have been pouring in, including impalement and burning him alive. Even though the U.S.-led war against ISIS has been waging on for 7 months, ISIS has been undeterred.
Well, 2014 opened old wounds for U.S. troops, with ISIS exploding and spreading fast in Syria, and 3,000 troops returning to Iraq for a training mission. Now, retired military general Barry McCaffrey said, "It's hard to imagine a modest training mission in Iraq being the key to gluing that country back together. I think it's come apart, and it'll have to settle upon new geopolitical grounds."
In Afghanistan, December 25th, 2014, the President Obama, he announced that after 13 years of war, they were ending the war in that country. But the war there isn't really ending. And yes, military families will have to give up their loved ones to support the local security forces in Afghanistan, with the mission's success being far from certain. Now, the U.S. now seems to be in a semi-permanent state of war, unable to break from the past. So they're stuck in that continual war. That's right. Well, if you're tired of seeing or experiencing all the turmoil that is taking place in our global society right now, there is something you can do. There is a peaceful solution. You can contact the House of Yahweh and request your free monthly newsletter and Prophetic Word magazine to find out what you and your family can do to come out of this dark and dying world.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at The House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites, www.yahweh.com, www.yisroelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can email them at info@yahweh.com, and for any calls outside the United States, please call the number on your screen.
Now grab your pencil and your paper and the Holy Scriptures, because up next is Yisroel Hawkins bringing the words of life. For all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.